Hi, my name's Luke and I'm part of the leadership team at G2. Been around for a little while at G2 since we began in 2005. Still as passionate as ever, and I'm loving these small groups. I don't know about you, but in our small group we have great discussions. So I want to leave plenty of space for that. I'll try and do a little bit of teaching today. We're looking at a couple of parables. In fact, barely more than a couple of sentences each. It's the mustard seed and the yeast. So the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed and it's like yeast that's in some bread. So we're looking at that one today. It's Matthew 13, 31 to 35. So if you want to get your Bibles out, your phones out, whatever, you can do that, line it up for later. But I want to give you plenty of space for discussion so that you can really get into this stuff yourself. So I'll try and do a little bit of content and then you do most of the work. Before we had kids, Hannah and I went on holiday to Spain. We started in Andalusia actually, and then we did a bit of a road trip right from the south of Spain all the way up to the north, and we finished in Rioja, and that is one of our favourite places to go on the planet. We've had such a good time there on a couple of occasions. We've often said we'd like to maybe retire there. Don't know if we will or not, but it's the kind of place where it's just a bit of heaven for us. And we went to a bodega, a vineyard, and we were taken around. It was just a small family vineyard, organically produced, beautiful setting with the fields where you can see the mountains in the distance. You've got the rows of immaculate vines that have been tended to by generations of all from the same family. And we turned up, we'd missed the tour. It was earlier that day on that occasion and we were there totally the wrong time of day. So we thought we missed it. But the guy just was so welcoming and he took us in and said, let me just show you around and give you a tour anyway. So we did that. It was brilliant. And I can just remember being completely blown away at each of the times when he explained a bit about how wine was made. And I was like, I knew that you needed sugar for things to ferment, for alcohol to be made. So I was like, when do you add the sugar? He's like, no, we get all the grapes, we put them in this massive vat, and that's it. That's how you make wine. I'm like, but when do you add the sugar? He's like, no, you don't add sugar. It's all in there. And I was like, well, you need yeast. When do you add the yeast? No, not in this method of wine production. In mass marketed stuff, they do add yeast separately, but in organically produced traditional wine, they don't, because the yeast grows on the grape. And I was just like, wow, that's amazing. So you literally just put it in a big thing, and then there's a process of how you extract the juice and how that comes out and for how long it's in oak for and how long it's in bottles for and all the rest of it. That whole thing is different everywhere. But what's consistent at this place is it's just all already in the ingredients. Now, it totally blew me away. By the way, what also blew me away is that white and red wine is both made from red grapes. I was like, hang on a second, surely white wine is made from, the sort of green grapes that you buy, and they laugh their heads off and they're like, no one ever makes wine from green grapes. People just eat those in the supermarkets. They buy them and people like the look of them. They taste nice, but no one ever makes wine from that. White wine has just not had the skins added to the liquid. Now, some of you are going, I've been around a vineyard. I know all this stuff, Luke. Why on earth are you telling me this? And some of you are thinking, really? White wine doesn't come from green grapes? That's mad. Anyway, it's true though. So I want you to have a discussion in your group. Now, have you ever been round a vineyard? Have you done a tour around a vineyard or a distillery or something? Or have you ever made fresh bread? Because we're going to talk about yeast in a minute. So have you ever made fresh bread at home, or have you ever been to a vineyard? Okay, discuss that now. Okay, in just a second, I'm going to get you to read the passage in your group. Maybe try and read more than one version if you can, because it's quite a short passage and there might be some different things that are brought out from that. You might notice some different words that are used, so that might help you as well. So we'll do that in a second. But just a little bit of the context. Like Jesus in this passage Matthew's collating a load of stories and parables of particularly to do with the kingdom of heaven in this whole chapter in Matthew 13. And there's like, I guess the most basic takeaway from this the reading is Jesus is trying to say, you guys don't get the way that we, the Godhead, like God, Father, Son, and Spirit, see power and lordship, right? So, and he's like, you think it's all about size and might and strength, and it's not. It doesn't matter if it's tiny, it can grow into something big. So whether it's a tiny seed or if it's yeast, it can have a huge effect. So that's like the basic thing he's saying. And actually he's like, doesn't really work like that in the kingdom. So he gives you a little hint at the kingdom of heaven. Now, the kingdom of heaven is an interesting phrase. It's not really used in the Old Testament. So to the guys who are listening to it and hearing his parables, there would be a bit of a new phrase for them. The kingdom of God is used in other places, but the kingdom of heaven's a bit of a new phrase. We don't hear that loads before. So, well, we take it for granted, don't we? Because we know, oh yeah, the kingdom of heaven, yeah, blah, blah, blah. Jesus talked about all that time. But when those people are hearing it for the first time, it's a bit of a new thing. And remember, God didn't want kings in the first place. He had judges, and the people of Israel, the Hebrews, they didn't have Israel at that stage. The Hebrews were desperate for kings, and they pleaded for kings, and eventually they got Saul and then David and Solomon and so on. But God was kind of like, no, but it will end up being all about power and might if you go down the king route. It's not really my way. So the kingdom of heaven is an interesting play on that as well as a concept. And Jesus, also remember this, Jesus is not yet the king in the sense that he is the Christ. He is going to fulfill that, but he hasn't yet fulfilled it. So he's come as the Son of Man, but he hasn't yet gone to the cross, died, and risen again and ascended to heaven, right? That's not yet happened. So when he's telling this parable and saying about the kingdom of heaven, they're not, most people who are listening, possibly the exception of Peter or something who's just clocking that he is the Christ, most people listening are not thinking, oh yeah, well, you're the king. You're describing the kingdom of heaven and you're the king. They're thinking, this guy's like a prophet or something. He's something of God about him and he's speaking. I like being around him. I like what he says. He seems to be wise beyond his years. I don't quite get a lot of what he says. It's mystical, but I want more. So that's the context. And he's also interrupting their narrative. He does this all the time. He interrupts what they think they're going to hear from him. So the parables, he flips them on their head. We'll hear a bit more after you've read the passage out loud about that. So would you maybe go for more than one version if you can, read the passage together now. It's Matthew 13, verses 31 to 35. Okay, so let's start with the mustard seed bit, and then we'll talk about the yeast bit in a minute, right? Now, the mustard seed is fantastic because it says here, even though it's the smallest of seeds, it's not actually, true biologically. There are seeds that are smaller. The poppy seed is smaller, for example. But in that ancient world, in the first century, they would have accepted that to have been an incredibly small seed. It would have been well known, right? Okay, so there's just a little bit of detail in case some of you are going, is it that small? It's actually not really microscopic, but it's a tiny seed and it produces a big plant. And that is really what's being illustrated here by Jesus. He's not talking about the sort of biological accuracy of it. But what he is doing is he's creating an irony that everyone in that time would have known, but we could easily miss. So it says, a man takes a mustard seed and plants it in his field, or he plants it in his garden in some translations. Right, this is not something that a man would do. If you had a field or a garden, well, firstly, people didn't garden in the same way that they do now. They didn't have like nice looking gardens. But if they did have a field, or if they did have somewhere where they would plant stuff for crops, what they're not going to do is plant a mustard seed. It doesn't produce something that's really useful, and it self-plants, it self-spreads. It is a weed. It's not something that people would go, oh, great. Like, what I'm only really learning about gardening, but there's weeds that you're like, no, this is like saying, Alan Titchmarsh took a dandelion and planted it in his lawn and thought, I'll try and get as many dandelions as possible. Like, that's not what you're going to do in a nice lawn. And in the same way, you're not going to plant a mustard seed. So there's irony being used here. Jesus is telling it to them. They would go, what? Why would a man do that? But also when it grows, it does grow to a bigger size. It grows rapidly and it grows to a bigger thing pretty quickly. But what it doesn't do is become the kind of place where birds would make a home. Birds are not going to make a nest in a mustard plant. It's a bit like, you know how sunflowers shoot up really quickly, and you get kids sometimes to do that in school, and they'll grow a sunflower plant, and it will grow up, and then put it in the garden, and before you know it, at the end of the year, it's like 7 or 8 foot tall. If you're lucky, you get a massive one. But what you're not going to find is a bird making a nest in the sunflower. It's not going to happen. You might find a bird trying to steal some of the sunflower seeds, but there's an irony in that as well. The thing that's being described is more of a sort of bush than a tree. It could grow to about 10 foot tall, I suppose, but it's not really made of wood, so it's more of a plant. So it's not going to be something that a bird could nest in. So again, there's irony in that. They're like, well, why would that be the case? But it's constantly spreading. Now, here's a fascinating thing. The seed of the mustard seed doesn't need nurturing at all in order for it to grow into a plant. It's quite rare in that sense. It can fall on soil. It can die and become a tiny plant, put down roots and put up a shoot. It can do that without any water or any looking after. It just does it on its own. It takes, and this is mental, because Jesus is hinting at what is to come, I believe, in this parable through him, right? It takes 3 days for the seed to become a tiny plant. The process of it being dropped on the floor and it being a seed, dying and becoming a miniature microscopic plant, which is that's a complete process, isn't it? The germination of a seed is absolutely crazy process where it becomes a plant and it isn't a seed anymore. Jesus uses that analogy to describe himself, doesn't he? Unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies and becomes a plant. In this thing, it's crazy that it takes exactly 3 days for a mustard seed to die and become a tiny plant, which is the same amount of time that it takes Jesus from being crucified to resurrection. The 3 days from the Friday to Sunday. I think Jesus is hinting at that, but because people then would have known that it took about that. It's a quick process for a mustard seed to become a tiny plant. But they might not all know it's exactly 3 days, but they would have known it's a quick one. Lots of seeds take a lot longer than that. Maybe if you're trying to grow those seeds that we handed out in G2, you planted some of those things, you'll know it takes a lot longer than that for a lot of seeds. But the mustard seed, it takes 3 days. And here's an even crazier thing. It takes 50 days for that little plant to become the kind of plant that can drop more seeds. And it is exactly 50 days from the resurrection of Jesus to Pentecost. We know that because both of those events happened on particular high festivals in the Jewish calendar. We know when Jesus came in on Palm Sunday, everyone was gathering in Jerusalem for that particular event, and we know what was happening in Jerusalem when he died, and we also know that everyone was gathering in Jerusalem for another festival when the Holy Spirit came at Pentecost. So it's exactly 50 days between those things, and it's 50 days for a mustard seed to go on its journey from being a tiny plant to growing to a bigger plant at a point at which it can drop its seeds and spread more. So if you think to yourself that maybe there's something in this where Jesus is saying it's like a mustard seed that a guy plants in his garden, the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, and then the journey to the unstoppable exponential growth that is the early church that happens at Pentecost, only 50 days. On that day, 3,000 were added to their number and their growth continued at an exponential rate. So maybe he's getting at that, or maybe I'm reading far too much into it. Feel free to tear that apart and disagree with me and have a good discussion about that in your group. And after that, we'll come back and we'll discuss the yeast. So yeasts are crazy little things. They are living organisms. It's hard to imagine that, but in fact, on a large grape, there are more yeasts than there are humans on a planet. That's mad. That's absolutely mad. These things are really, really tiny, but they work together as a community. That's crucial for this analogy, isn't it? They literally are cultures themselves, and they will spread rapidly, but only at certain times, not the whole time. A friend of mine was telling me he'd been to a vineyard in Australia, and the winemaker had been saying to him, the Yeasts are a crazy little group of people. They're very lazy in the mornings, but they get pretty horny in the afternoon. That's when I want to make wine. No, sorry about the Australian accent. If you're listening, if the Hoskins family are listening, I just apologise. Sorry, Amy. Anyway, they say that the yeasts want to multiply rapidly in the afternoon, and that's when wine is made. That's when the fermentation process particularly kicks off. They can actually measure that stuff. But the fact is, they are tiny little organisms which don't exist on their own. They only work when they're interconnected. They provide this culture and they grow things rapidly. Now, in this thing that Jesus says, and the other parable, the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it was worked through the dough. Again, like I said before, when Jesus tells these parables, he uses everyday normal stuff that everyone could understand. It's not like like fanciful kind of thing that, everyday people couldn't understand. These are normal everyday things, gardeners with fields with seeds or yeast in a domestic house situation. But what they would have known that we could easily miss is that's a bonkers situation. There's absolutely no way that a woman in a first century Israel domestic house would have 60 pounds of flour. That is enough to make 150, that is enough to feed 150 people. There's no way that, like a housewife or something in that time would be making enough bread to make, to feed 150 people. It just wouldn't happen. I guess you might be if you had a wedding on the way, but even then that's an awful lot of bread to be making because you can't really keep it for very long. It doesn't last too long. You've not got refrigerators or anything like that, so it pretty much needs to be consumed pretty quickly. So that's an irony that Jesus is using. Most people would know that's a crazy amount of bread to be making. Why would you do that? But it speaks into the provision of God, the abundance, the unstoppable exponential growth that is being hinted at with the mustard seed as well. What also happens with yeast is once the yeast is in the dough, you can't take it out. It's inextricably connected to the dough. You couldn't then go, oh, do you know what? I think we're meant to make unleavened bread. Can we just whip the yeast out and just make some pita bread? That's not going to happen. It's become part of the fabric of that dough. So it is with us, with Christians that are in society. Once the kingdom of heaven has been released in the form of those of us who follow the King, once we are into the fabric of that society, you can't take it out. Once the society has been built on Christian values, it can make some decisions and change some laws to go away from it, but you'll never extract it. You can't take it out. It's like yeast in dough. You just can't separate it again. So I think that's what's being got at here. You can't take that out and you can't stop a mustard seed from spreading. So it is with us. So it is with our faith. Once it's in you, once you've accepted the gospel in you, it just starts to permeate into every area of your being. It affects your decisions. It affects your friendships. It affects the words that you use. And in the same way, once you are into a culture and you've had that impact, once you've spoken hope into the lives of the people around you, you can't take that back. You can't, not that you'd want to, but it's into the grain of society. So let's finish with a discussion and then can you pray for each other? So for this next bit, can I suggest you get into groups of two? Just discuss this in twos and then pray for each other. Here's two questions that you could use to discuss this. And if you want to just discuss something else and take it in a different direction, you can do that. That's totally fine. But here's my suggestion. If you are a heavenly mustard seed, what effect do you have? So imagine your normal everyday place, whether that's in a work or in a home environment or at university or whatever. What effect do you have if you imagined yourself to be this heavenly mustard seed or a mustard plant that's spreading? Or if you are heavenly yeast, how do you affect, if you're like yeast in the dough of the world around you, what's happening? How are you spreading, and how are you affecting the environment around you? So if you're a little mustard seed or a mustard plant or yeast, how are you changing the world around you? Because I think that's what we're called to do. Okay, go for it. And then don't forget to pray for each other at the end.